Good morning. My name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin our discussion today, I want to acknowledge that I am participating in this webinar from Ottawa, located on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. As an organization, we recognize there are many steps on the road to reconciliation, and that is a journey that we must all take together. We are now a few short days away from the federal election. In a new record, 2 million people voted on the first day of the advanced polls. Clearly, Canadians are engaged in this election and eager to have their say. There's no doubt that the political landscape in Canada is in a time of upheaval, and this is a considerable election with people interested in considerable change. The election on Monday could have significant impacts on agriculture and agri-food in Canada. But ultimately, all policy that we do here at a Policy Institute is political, and campaigns are supposed to set the direction for a government's mandate. So today we want to dive into the intersection of policy and politics and what the current federal election might mean for agriculture and agri-food. We've put together a great panel to get into the topic. Two of the three panelists and myself have past experience working on campaigns as partisans. The three of us have worked as political staffers and have worked in campaigns on the side. While our present roles keep us in the realm of politics and policy, no one is currently affiliated with a current campaign, and they're not here to speak on behalf of a political party. I expect we'll get into what goes well and what doesn't, but we're not asking any of them to defend any partisan interest today. We want a genuine discussion around the state of agriculture policy and politics in the current campaign. But before we get started, we want to hear from you. As we've been doing of late, we've got a poll that we're going to share with a simple question. Do you think ag policy got enough attention in this election campaign? The choices we're giving you today are yes, no, but more than in the last election. So please take an opportunity, tell us what you think, and that will help inform our discussion this morning. Let us know whether or not you think agriculture is getting the attention that it warrants and deserves. And we'll get into that later. So if you take a minute, please click yes, no, or no, but more than in the last election. And then we'll share the results with you before we get started in the discussion. So our results show that no, almost 3/4 of the people today think agriculture did not get enough attention in this election campaign. We'll wait and see now what the panelists have to say. So I'd like to get right into it with our first panelist this morning. Our first panelist is Jeff English. He is the Vice President, Marketing and Communications at Pulse Canada. After graduating from the University of Ottawa with a Bachelor's of Social Science, and Jeff built a career in ag sector. He worked for a member of Parliament at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and ThinkShift prior to his current role at Pulse Canada. Jeff and I were colleagues in the minister's office in the last Conservative government. Jeff, thank you for joining us. I want to start with kind of that time in working in a minister's office in an election campaign. I think sometimes we don't have a good understanding of the divisions between the roles and responsibilities of a minister versus a partisan candidate. And we've seen this election campaign. Mark Carney has switched between those kind of roles as Prime Minister and Liberal leader several times. In the past, you worked for the minister during an election campaign as a minister. And I'm wondering if you could start us off by talking about that experience and how governments work during election campaigns. And I think that we've clearly seen this interest around the trade war that we're living through now. But in 2015, you were working for the agriculture minister when TPP negotiations were going on, when the Prime Minister announced conclusions of that. So walk us through what's that like, and how do you navigate the role between partisan interests and government interests as a minister?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler, and thanks for having me. As you rightly point out, in 2015, I was the ministerial staffer assigned to Minister Ritz at the time in his capacity as agriculture minister. And every minister of the crown would have that kind of conduit from a political staff perspective to feed back into the department. So while there's no parliament to sit in and parliament's dissolved, the ministerial roles are still active and functioning. And I think we're getting a bit of a taste of that right now with all the rabble rousing from down south, that it's been important for the government to still be able to function as a government as things arise. And in 2015, we were at the height of TPP negotiations, and because of the multilateral nature of that deal, it wasn't really up to Canada when it was going to be signed. It was more of a group decision. So, everything from liaising messages into the minister, assuring that he or she's properly briefed on issues as they're arising. And there's some pretty strict rules for anyone who's been that staffer there. Like you're not a campaign staffer. You're not to participate in the campaign. You work for the federal government, just as you would expect members of the civil service not to be actively campaigning. And so it's a bit of a different role, a little bit unique. And I think oftentimes can be quite dull, because depending on the file, depending on what's happening in the world, there's not a lot to go on or to report. But in rare instances, like in 2015 with TPP, like you're seeing now with the threat of tariffs and the ongoing threat of tariffs, it is important for government to be able to function and to walk and chew gum at the same time.
And what's your, again, I think there's been some criticism of the Carney as Liberal leaders spent more time as prime minister than's necessary, but I suppose that comes down to kind of where you sit or where you see these things, and their view is that this is an important thing to be doing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the public will decide. They have a pretty good capacity of what passes the smell test in terms of things that require immediate attention versus moments to look to be prime ministerial. As mentioned, and during the TPP negotiations, and when Prime Minister Harper did sign the deal, I think perhaps even Minister Fast left Canada to fly. Correct me if I'm wrong, overseas to put a signature on a piece of paper. The government of the time as well announced a pretty hefty compensation package for supply managed farmers who were going to be impacted by that deal. Those weren't campaign announcements. That was the government doing what the government thought was necessary. And so I think that it's always easy to take shots on one side or the other. If my guy's doing something, then it's probably okay. But if it's the other guy, maybe less so. But I think that by and large, people have a pretty good sense of that themselves, and the public can make up its own mind of what's enough and what's not enough.
And I think it is, as often happens in campaigns, where people can kind of speak to their one side. Some conservatives maybe forgot about the things that Harper did in the 2015 campaign.
And necessary things, right? Just as I think we would argue that it's important a Canadian cabinet today have a response prepared if our largest trading partner is creating some issues. I mean, many folks rely on trade with the United States to make their living, and so there are certain things that are going to come to the head during election campaigns that are just unavoidable and beyond our control. And I think it's important we have a government that can react.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, thank you, Jeff, for helping us set the stage. Going to bring our second panelist in now. Sangeeta Lalli is the Public Policy Director, TELUS Agriculture Consumer Goods. Sangeeta specializes in public affairs, advocacy, and policy in agriculture and food. At TELUS Ag, she works with industry, government, and academia to create more opportunities for deploying technology in the sector. In her past work, she advised the Federal Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, supported the development of the Canadian Ag Partnership and Canada's negotiations in CUSMA, and served as the BC advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. Sangeeta, I want to get into kind of that policy dynamic of the role that policy plays in campaigns. Kim Campbell infamously said that an election is no time to discuss serious issues. Based on your experience as a campaigner, political staffer, and now someone doing public affairs, do you think that campaigns are time for these things? And do we have the right expectations for the role that policy plays in them?
Well, during this election, very, very serious issues have been central to the campaign. And in every election, you really need to meet Canadians where they're at and engage on the issues that they care about. While most people won't care about every single item that's in a policy platform, many people today are looking for a prime minister who can stand up to Trump and help the country navigate through the rough waters that we're in. And they want to know how that prime minister will do it. And that's where parties need direction and policies to guide that path forward. Now, you might see some specific regional policies or commitments targeted at certain regions that parties think they can pick up, or where they might need some sort of differentiator at the doors. But from a local campaign perspective, and on the ground in each individual riding, their job is to knock on doors, make calls, and identify voters, not to create policy at the local level. So, it's a difference between the air game and the ground game, where air game will focus more on policy, but on the ground, you're knocking on those doors.
But even with the air game today, kind of what's your sense though of how much of that air game is about kind of vision and perception versus kind of the specific commitments, whether it be tax cuts that we've seen or kind of the approach to Trump at the end of the day?
It's the vision and the approach to Trump. Like that is what's taking up most of the space this campaign. There are some policy ideas that will be used in the messaging to highlight how to deal with the US and how to diversify trade and how to have less dependency on the US. But this campaign is very focused on public perception of who can handle the US and who can handle Trump.
And do you think we put too much focus, or there has been in the past too much emphasis around platforms themselves? I know that this has been kind of a topic of discussion on some of the kind of the political class during the campaign. Do we put too much emphasis on the idea of having a platform that is that roadmap for each party or that guiding document that they have?
Well, the roadmap helps the bureaucracy figure out what their direction is going to be once a government is formed, but it also does help with communications and messaging at the air game level on what to actually say to Canadians when they are asking for responses, and the messaging that you're going to send out on a daily basis, as well as how you're going to respond to media. I mean, most politicians will use the platform in response to any questions that they get. We see that in the debates as well. The debates didn't have anything particularly new that came out. It was the announcements that they had announced to date and the content that was in the platforms that each of the parties put forward.
And do you think it makes a difference that we get the platforms themselves in the last week? I mean, the two leading parties both released their platforms after advanced voting had started. Does that make a difference?
It was later than I was expecting. But again, by then, most of the items had already been announced. There was very little that was left or unveiled in the policy platforms. So I think that you end up getting them you end up getting the items that are in the policy platform throughout the whole campaign. And in this case, they decided to put them out in the last week rather than, like, usually it's done in week 3 or right before the debate.
And do you think that the costing of the platforms matter at the end of the day? Again, I think that is often the piece that is kind of the big reveal on platform day is what do all of those numbers add up to and where are some of the surprises? And I think, again, the two main parties have both gotten some criticism. People have been poking at some of the numbers and some of the math that's in the document and kind of looking at either cuts or gaps or how that plays out. Again, should we read a lot into that, especially in the context of a very uncertain economic environment?
In any election I've been involved in, I've never gotten the sense that has been an issue of the day, to be quite honest. And in this election, again, the main focus is on the United States, how we're going to deal with the United States. And it doesn't seem like folks on the ground are focusing on that costing out piece right now.
Right. And so I think you're saying that Kim Campbell was partly right when she said, or wrong when she says that it's no time to talk about serious issues, because we have been talking about serious issues like the US election, but that doesn't mean we talk about the election isn't a policy debate.
The policies support the issues of the day, right? So you do still need policies, you need responses to the issues of the day, but at the end of the day, you need to respond to whatever Canadians care about during the campaign period. And right now it's the US. And anybody who's not talking about the US and how to deal with President Trump is going to have a difficult time, I think, garnering support of Canadians.
Okay, well, we will come back to the discussion around platforms later. Sangeeta, thank you for that. I'll bring in our third panelist now. Our third panelist, the non-recovering partisan, is Kelvin Heppner. He's the field editor at RealAgriculture. He's reported on Canadian agriculture for more than 15 years. When he's not working on a story, radio show, or podcast, he's usually in the chicken barn or in a field at home as he farms with his family near Altona, Manitoba. Kelvin, you cover ag policy as kind of part of the beat and what you do. You pay more attention to this. We're used to ag not being part of the mainstream news, but but it seems like this election hasn't made much of a splash in ag media either. Can you talk about kind of your approach to kind of covering these issues in a campaign? What are the expectations you would have had going into it, and do you think elections make it easier or harder to cover ag policy at the end of the day?
Some good questions, Tyler, and thank you for having me. I think in many ways this is an abnormal election, unprecedented. That word gets used a lot these days, and I think it applies again in this situation. Canadian elections don't usually hinge on foreign policy issues or trade, at least not since 1988, I guess, the NAFTA debate when that Mulroney won. But President Trump, as Sangeeta and Jeff have alluded to, has kind of flipped the game board in the last couple of months, and we've seen this unprecedented swing from the Conservatives back to the Liberals. And I think in many ways, the ag media's coverage of the election is also affected by that. The whiplash of that swing and that broader geopolitical story, I think, has sucked maybe some of the oxygen away from diving into specific ag policy issues. We're not debating the future of publicly funded wheat breeding or specific ag type policies like that. We're focusing on trade and broader issues, which I think I maybe would take a contrarian view on the consensus to the poll question you asked, where I think we can actually argue that the predominant issue in this election is an agriculture issue. We're talking about the Canadian economy, trade, tariffs, the relationship with the US, our largest trading partner, cutting red tape, interprovincial trade, investing in export infrastructure. I just made a quick list here of all the things that are forefront in this election campaign discussion. Those are all things that in agriculture we're usually complaining that politicians don't spend enough time talking about. We wish they would focus more on. I think we are maybe wishing that there was still some more detail to these discussions. But I think in many ways the mainstream issues are also agriculture issues, and so I think there has actually been a lot of discussion about things that are relevant to agriculture in this election campaign.
And and so you talked about kind of that desire for an extra level of detail, though, or maybe we've been missing some of that. I mean, as much as we talk about kind of that trade issue or internal trade barriers, and those are like there are connections to agriculture. Do you really see agriculture getting used there? And then I guess I'm curious as to how you see the agriculture media kind of pulling that down a level, and how much you're able to better understand what does that actually mean in the agriculture context in an election campaign.
Yeah, maybe interprovincial trade might not be the best example, but when we're talking about investing in export infrastructure, as the main parties have, when we're talking about economic growth and finding new trading partners, diversifying trade, those are things that we always talk about in ag, and that most farm groups are also focused on. And of course, trade negotiations, both parties have talked about renegotiating or the arrangement with the US, whatever that looks like, as well as pursuing new trade deals in both the Liberal and Conservative platforms. There was mention of pursuing new trade deals, which our agriculture sector is usually interested in. There is one other factor, I think, Tyler, that we should also acknowledge, and I'm not speaking about our company, but generally about the ag media, and I think that is that our capacity to cover a federal election isn't what it used to be either in terms of Canadian ag media. The number of farm broadcasters in our country who used to host election debates and put candidates on the spot is not what it used to be. The number of media outlets, the number of dedicated reporters covering federal politics, asking those specific hard-hitting questions to try to get some of those answers, get that level of detail, isn't what it used to be in general. And so I think we're seeing some of that. And I know we've heard about cuts to the media in the mainstream sense for years. I think we've been shielded to some extent in agriculture media, but some of those things I think are happening, and we're seeing maybe some impact. I think that's something we have to consider at least as maybe a factor in why we haven't seen ag policy make a bigger splash in this election campaign as well.
I think I'm glad that you brought that up, Kelvin, because again, I think that we're in this kind of challenging world, right? Where on one hand, it's never been easier to get information, kind of we're in an information overload. And in theory, again, you've got campaigns putting out content all of the time, and you can really be saturated by it. But the ability to kind of cut through that and understand what's good or bad or not, or kind of what's fact or fiction is is harder. Do you want to maybe kind of expand on that again, in whether or not that saturation of information from other sources during an election campaign influences or kind of changes how you think about and do things?
Well, I think I think there's we need more room, more of a push to get candidates on the spot, and that's real difficult in this media environment where the media that comes from the parties is from the top, and it's the leadership's messaging. Sangeeta talked about the air versus ground game, and it's difficult to get detailed answers through the air game, and that's where I think it's a difficult environment for media to get answers in, and we've seen this example as well with the Conservative Party, for example, not having reporters on the bus, and reporters have complained about not having access, not being able to get some of those on the ground type stories from the Poilievre campaign. And I think it's like you say, there's more information than ever available to the public, but I'd say a higher percentage of it is from a partisan biased source, and so it's more difficult for voters to actually get nitty gritty in terms of differences between parties' positions and where they stand, and have those commitments with a level of detail where there can be some accountability later on.
Well, and that is part of what we're here to do today, Kelvin, is to get a little bit nitty gritty. And so we'll get ready to bring Jeff and Sangeeta back into the discussion, but I'll stay with you for a minute to talk about platforms. And again, we're a policy institute. I like to kind of walk out on all things policy related. I think it's fair to say that the Liberal NDP bloc platforms were pretty predictable from an ag perspective. We can talk about some of that. Probably the surprise this campaign was the Conservative platform, or the lack thereof from an ag perspective. Kelvin, you talked about kind of getting nitty gritty. When you kind of look through and look at those things, kind of what's your takeaway of what we see out of ag commitments? And then I'll get Jeff and Sangeeta to come in and provide their perspectives on that too. But Kelvin, why don't you kick that off?
Well, we definitely saw the Liberals come out with a much more comprehensive platform in general, including on the ag side of things. The Conservative platform did not have many mentions of agriculture, and I believe one of the main ones was regarding protection of foreign ownership of farmland in Canada. But again, I'm a policy wonk as well, like you are, Tyler, and I think like a lot of people watching this and listening to this webinar are. We would like more detail. We would like more of a commitment so that, like Sangeeta said, it provides direction to the bureaucracy, it provides direction to stakeholders. Everybody, farmers across the country would like to have that level of detail, I think, and would benefit from it. But from a political perspective, if you look at examples across the country, in the US, there are increasingly more examples of politicians winning campaigns that share very little in terms of detail, and mainly just signal 3 to 5 kind of key points, main messaging. Look at President Trump's win in the US last fall. Look at Doug Ford's victory in Ontario recently. From a political perspective, it's not good. It's not good for democracy. It's not good for accountability for elected officials. But I can see why parties refrain or are increasingly releasing less detailed platforms, and I think that's what the Conservatives did. I think the Conservatives have made some commitments in speeches and interviews over the last year. I know behind the scenes there's been work going on into a more comprehensive ag plan, or plan for agriculture policy, but it wasn't in the platform that was announced this week. And so there's things like reform to the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, PMRA, or Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Some of that type of work has definitely happened behind the scenes and been talked about in public, but not in the platform. And so, yeah, if the Conservatives do somehow win the election, those commitments are less concrete maybe than something that was posted in an official PDF on the party website this week, over the last week.
And so, Sangeeta, do you want to come in and kind of share your thoughts, your reactions to the platforms, and what you saw, and any surprises that you saw when you're looking through them?
Yeah, on the lack of agriculture and Conservative platforms, I mean, they don't typically need to work too hard to get votes in rural areas. They predominantly win those ridings. The platform doc that they put together is more closely aligned to the key positions on axing taxes and being tough on crime, which doesn't necessarily align well with agriculture policies. I would think generally parties are looking for policies that can reach as many people as possible. And if there is a focus on agriculture commitments, they need to be agriculture commitments that will be broad and can be applied to most farmers and ranchers across the country. And like Kelvin said earlier, economic and trade issues are taking up most of the space this election, and food and agriculture are a key part of both the economy and trade here in Canada. And agriculture touches so many different policies that were raised by various campaigns, like in the Liberal platform, the commitments on AI and digitization. That's an opportunity that the agriculture sector could jump into, but it's going to require a lot of engagement in terms of educating governments on how the industry works, what the industry needs, so that the industry gets a piece of that pie at the end of the day of commitments that were made that agriculture could jump into, but might not have been necessarily just for agriculture.
Right. So for those that are watching, please feel free to use the opportunity to use the Q&A function to send questions into our panel. We're happy to get to those. But Sangeeta, it sounds like in your mind, a lack of ag commitments in the Conservative platform is not that big of a deal, is what I'm hearing you say. Is that kind of how you read things?
I mean, we'll see how it comes out on election day, but I would think that many ridings in Saskatchewan will go to the Conservatives. I would think the majority of Alberta goes to Conservatives. A good chunk of Manitoba will probably as well, and a lot of those ridings will be heavy when it comes to the agriculture sector, as well as rural BC.
And so Jeff, what are your thoughts on the platforms and the lack of ag commitments in the Conservative one?
Well, maybe different from yourself and Kelvin, I'm not a policy wonk who will never profess to be one. I'm a communications guy. And so I think the importance of something like a platform is maybe diminished, even over the last 10, 20 years, I would say. I think you see that bear out in the fact that they were released about a week before the votes. In fact, the Conservative one, after advance polls had been open. So I wouldn't make too much of it one way or another. Again, I think it's one of those things where if you liked what you saw, it was included, you could say, look at the platform. If it's not there, you could use it as oh, look, these folks aren't caring about us in this way, shape, or form. I think that, for like most of us, it's kind of like the terms and conditions when you download a new iPhone software. You might have clicked that you read it, but did you actually read it? And I think that parties are probably banking on the fact that most of us are not downloading the PDF off their website and doing find all mentions of this kind of stuff. Maybe this panel excluded, but I think I look more for broad strokes in messaging and form, and obviously the relationship with the United States has dominated the election, as you might expect that it would. But what are the big themes that the parties are talking about, and how might that translate into their approach to agriculture? So whether it's talking about reductions in things like red tape, making it easier to do business, advancing things like trade. I think that's what I would expect to see from each of the parties in terms of the practical application of okay, we're in power now. What does agriculture policy look like under us?
So Jeff, Sangeeta touched on this reality though that regardless of the lack of ag platform commitments, farmers across the country are likely going to be represented by a Conservative member of Parliament after the election, given in part the rural-urban divide and in the way these things go. Is that kind of reality that farmers are typically seen to vote blue? Do you think that this is playing a role into this and kind of some of that dynamic around one party may take it for granted and the other party may not try very hard at the end of the day to get votes? Is that
Yeah,
something?
and I don't know that that's necessarily unique to farmers or to agriculture as a sector. I think there's probably a handful of sectors that could be applied to. Certainly in Western Canada has a pretty good record of electing Conservative candidates, and out east perhaps a little bit more of a mixed bag. But I think that it's easy to say, well, what's in this for me? I'm looking for something in a policy document for me, and I want to see myself reflected. It's a campaign's 36 days. It's 36 opportunities to connect with as wide of a swath as Sangeeta said of voters as possible. And I think that's why you see leaders spending an inordinate amount of time in places like the Greater Toronto area, suburban Vancouver, in Montreal, fishing where the fish are, so to speak. And that does mean sometimes that those of us in rural Western Canadian ridings probably shouldn't expect a whistle-stop tour from a leader that comes by. Those are the decisions that honestly get made months in advance. I mean, it can always be adjusted based on how polls are going and where the leader may want to stop into. But you know, if you're not in kind of a key strategic region where a party feels that it might be looking to pick up votes or to make gains, it's not uncommon to maybe feel not seen in these type of documents.
Sangeeta, do you think there are kind of consequences in the policy space and kind of in the results, actions we get from government because agriculture farmers, the sector isn't in one of those kind of key regions or seen to be kind of these key hotly contested sectors that gets fought over in an election campaign?
No, I mean, post-government, there is a minister responsible for agriculture. There's a minister responsible for transportation. There's a minister responsible for trade, and health. Like, let's not forget about CFIA and PMRA. Agriculture touches so many of these different departments that once a government is formed, even if it's not in a policy platform, there will be decisions made that impact the agriculture sector, and the agriculture sector will be engaged by the government at the time, no matter which party ends up governing.
Right. So Kelvin, one of the opportunities to get a deeper dive into policy issues is the Ag Leaders Debate that's hosted by the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. That was last week and is available on their YouTube channel. If you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, do go check it out. But maybe, Kelvin, if you could start by giving us some of the Coles notes around kind of what you saw and what you took away from the discussion in that debate.
Well, I think it's a valuable exercise, and I think credit to Canadian Federation of Agriculture for continuing to organize it. Also credit to the candidates for showing up. I know not everybody was or at times it maybe wasn't clear whether all the parties would send their top ag voices, including John Barlow, the Shadow Minister of Agriculture for the Conservatives, and Cody Blois, who was appointed Agriculture Minister by Prime Minister Carney in the weeks leading up to the election campaign. They were both participating in the debate. So, and then I think in many ways, and this also maybe ties in with your earlier question, Tyler, as to why we haven't seen more ag policy discussion in this election. Right now, the Conservatives and the Liberals, especially since Cody Blois became the ag minister, have a lot of areas where they're aligned actually on ag policy in the future of ag policy when it comes to cutting red tape, when it comes to reforming CFIA and PMRA. It's there are not many major wedge issues such as there was say 2011 with the wheat board or that type of issue where the Conservatives and Liberals were on clear different sides on an agriculture issue. I think the biggest wedge issue on ag policy right now is around climate policy and how that gets handled going forward, how it pertains with the output-based carbon trading system for the industrial emitters and that type of thing, whether there's carbon credits available to farmers. I think that's where there is some differentiation, but that's certainly not on the top 5, top 10 list of priorities in the public discussion right now. So I think in many ways, going back to the leaders' debate last week, it showed that there isn't a lot of disagreement between the parties at the top of the polls right now. And so in some ways, maybe that hurts the hype or the buzz coming out of a debate like that. If you're hoping for conflict and hoping for disagreement, I'm not sure there was a whole lot of that. And I think also the debate format in some ways, I think you can always look at improving debate formats. There's no perfect way of doing it. I'm personally a fan of more hard-hitting specific questions rather than the broad-ranging type questions, as I think that's how you can get into some of the differences between the candidates. And I'm not sure there was a lot of that done during the debate, the way the current format works. We also have to remember the Bloc, the Greens, and the NDP were also participating in the debate. And let's face it, you have Barlow and Blois, who sit on the House of Commons Ag Committee, have spent dozens, hundreds of hours on the Ag Committee studying these files. And then you have some of these parties sending representatives who have a full-time job outside of politics, and they're up against these professional MPs in the debate. So I think maybe another way of improving the debate format would potentially be to just have the front runners participate. You could have them debate and really dig into the differences between the parties that actually have a chance of forming government. Yes, the NDP, the Greens, the Bloc have other ideas that they certainly bring value to the public discourse, but maybe in that format, as people are trying to make a decision between where the two front-running parties stand, maybe it would make sense to limit the debate down to having it could have been Blois versus Barlow, for example, last week, and dig into the differences, find out where there are actually some wedge issues between the Conservatives and Liberals. Just some ideas, and again, there's no perfect debate format, and it's also putting a lot of pressure on the moderators to of course come out and keep everybody happy in that type of thing as well. So, just some suggestions, some thoughts coming out of last week.
So Sangeeta, is it if kind of an ag leaders debate is our one opportunity to get some details around what they're going to do on agriculture issues? Like, are we well served by the current approach? Do you think that there's anything interesting coming out of it? Worth noting, some of the comments that have already come in through the Q&A highlight that people weren't aware of it. So if this is our chance, is it well served? Would you do it differently? Would you like to see a different approach?
Well, very little typically comes out of debates that hasn't already been announced. Parties tend to stick to the script, or they'll try to come up with clips that they can clip for later to use on social media or in other communications. That being said, most people aren't going to read the platform, and having these sort of debates allows for parties to share their message in another medium that people, in this case, farmers in the agriculture sector, are more likely to actually tune into. Although judging from the comment you just made on comments of people not having known about it, I think that's a message to take back to the CFA to see how the communications can be broadened so that others in the sector are aware of the debate so that they can tune in.
Right. And Jeff, kind of thoughts on kind of formats or value, or how do we get more out of these things?
Yeah, I think anytime that federal politicians are getting together to talk about Canadian agriculture is an opportunity. Certainly in these types of things, like I recall again, from my time as a political staffer, the idea of attending a debate, usually in a province where you're not campaigning or where you aren't, is it can be a draw away from the riding. As I mentioned, like a campaign that's only 36 days. There's 36 opportunities for the person running to get out in their own riding and meet with potential constituents and kind of shore up support in their votes. So, to ask somebody like a John Barlow to get on drive to Calgary, to get on a plane, to come to Ottawa for probably the day before for a debate, to take is essentially asking him to take 2 to 3 days off of the campaign. So you want to make sure it's as meaningful as possible if you are going to come to something like that. Again, I agree largely with Sangeeta that the goal is survival. It's to not create anything new or cause any controversy for the campaign, and certainly for whatever your leader is out there talking about that day, as well as to really just to be able to amplify that message on social media, get out your message to your own constituency. And I think that those that are doing it right have been successful in that way, and that I don't have to sit and tune into the debate to know what somebody said, provided that they're clipping it right and making sure it finds my eyeballs.
Thank you.
For anybody interested in watching the CFA debate, it is available on YouTube.
And Kelvin?
I was just going to say, I disagree with Jeff and Sangeeta in it being about survival. I'm looking for new information and new nuggets of somebody admitting something that maybe wasn't public before, or plans for cuts or that type of thing. So, and I do think it is still a valuable exercise as well. We're talking about the public facing aspect of the debate, but I think there's value for farm groups and stakeholders in forcing the parties to figure out where they stand and to develop and test and come up with talking points and understand their policies internally. I think there's some value in creating this pinch point where the parties have to come up with where they stand on some of these issues.
I mean, I think, Kelvin, one of the things I'm taking away is that, going back to this idea that you get the governments that you elect, you and I wanting to kind of dive into details are probably different than the average Canadian, and that's why we end up with the governments that we do. But on that theme, again, one of these questions is, how do we make ag policy more relevant during elections? And so maybe I'd kind of ask that slightly different to say, is it reasonable to expect that ag policy will be more relevant during elections? And if not during elections, how do we make ag policy debate more relevant outside of elections as well? Sangeeta, do you want to take a crack at that one first, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first question to ask here is, do Canadians care about the issue, and will your ideas for the agriculture sector impact the majority of farmers? And is it among the top 3 things that farmers will say that they care about? If it's not, getting into the election platform or getting traction during a campaign is going to be very difficult. And then the other thing is that there are just so many different asks within the agriculture sector that the sector really needs to come together and have a few key asks, because there is a power in numbers, particularly when it comes to getting items into the platform. And the third is that anyone without any experience in the sector should be able to understand what we're actually talking about. If it's going to go in a policy platform, it needs to be easily communicated to the general public, whether or not they have experience in the sector. And if someone doesn't understand what the policy is for, it's taking up too much space in an election platform and in a campaign.
And I'm curious, there's a question around how do platforms bleed into mandate letters, and kind of how that plays out, right? So going back into kind of what comes next and after the election, Jeff, do you want to kind of maybe comment on kind of your experience around how these things actually relate together, and then what do you do after an election, again, when governing has to happen?
Yeah, I think if there are signature commitments made, I would go back to the removal of the single desk in 2011. That was obviously a cornerstone of conservative platform and policy that then, of course, was front and center in a mandate letter. I think that if there are things like that you can latch onto, they would typically make it in. In the case where it's more just those broader themes that I mentioned of talking about the tone and approach, it really comes down to those policy folks at the Prime Minister's office of where they want to see this go. This is an interesting time because we did see a number of policy changes announced by Prime Minister Carney, which were exact reversals of the government's approach for the last, say, 10 years, right before the election. So there hasn't been a lot of time, I think, for groups or for farmers even to gain an appreciation or understanding of what that means, or see that lived out. So if you think of some of the industry's larger asks over the last little bit of things about the carbon tax and those types of things, if you take the government of what it's saying, like, those issues have been resolved, so what next kind of thing. And I think that maybe some groups are starting to get some work done around that, or kind of wait and see how the election goes to start maybe some different types of advocacy on that. Mandate letters are what you make of them. They are directions, certainly, from the Prime Minister to his or her ministers of some key signature things that they would like to get done. I know Prime Minister Trudeau kind of maybe elevated their importance by making them public, and they became, I think, more of a communications document than a practical, here's the plan and what I'd like to see done. It's almost like a scorecard or a performance review for ministers, if you will. And we'll have to see what the new Prime Minister, be it Mr. Carney or Mr. Poilievre, how they approach that. But it is a time to inform what the mandate is going to look like and what the expectations are going to be for those ministers.
Again, there's some stories that we can tell from a kind of time in government where we ended up with something in a platform that became in a mandate letter that became a kind of an ongoing question around whether or not we really needed to live up to what was there, and kind of going back to the platform as a communications document. It's then you hit kind of reality as government, and kind of it becomes more than a communication exercise and maybe less relevant to governing day to day. Sangeeta.
The mandate letters also need to change. Ministers and departments will use the mandate letter to prioritize what needs to get done. So it's absolutely important to have the mandate letter, but there will be things that come up that were not planned, that we couldn't anticipate, that also need to get solved and also need time and also need resources. So the mandate letters, they're not a document that should ever be set in stone. It should change along with whatever the issues of the day are, because there are just so many things that we can't anticipate.
Yes,
I do,
found
however,
them,
hope they. Oh,
so I think you're dead on. It's a useful tool when you want to get something done very quickly. Certainly as a political staffer to remind the civil service about it being in the mandate letter. But as soon as you're trying to get something done that's not in the letter, it becomes much less important of a document. I think it's serves a purpose.
But I think that comes back to the point that somebody made earlier about, again, kind of what matters is kind of the vision and kind of high level kind of tone and approach people take or leaders, parties take during campaigns, and not about specific details. Again, there's questions that have come in around talk around the Grain Commission or funding for public plant breeding, and the reality is I think we haven't seen kind of those specific commitments, but what we're left to do is to kind of try and understand using tone and approach and language and priorities, then it is relatively, I think, easy to infer at a high level what parties will do on these things. But Kelvin, I want to get your perspective on a question that came up, because I think it goes back to the political dynamics that are at play and how that impacts the policy world. And the question is, can an agriculture minister from the East ever be acceptable to Western Canadian farmers? And I'm curious, as a Western Canadian farmer, Kelvin, kind of what your thoughts are on that, and because I think it does speak to kind of the political context that ag policy operates in.
That's a tough question to say yes to entirely acceptable. Right now there's a lot of concern that if the Liberals win this election, that Western Canada will not have feel represented and feel advocated for, especially on the trade front. We haven't really dived into the Chinese tariff issue right now and how little discussion there's been about that during this election campaign. I know that's a really sore point, and Jeff can speak further to this, as peas are of course affected by the tariffs on Chinese or on exports to China in retaliation to Canada's tariffs on Chinese EVs and steel and aluminum. So yeah, I think Minister Blois was gaining some ground. He does have more of that blue streak liberal type philosophy to his thinking, and I think he was reaching out to Western Canadian farmers and farm groups leading into the election. And if he remains ag minister after the election, he would certainly attempt that. But there will always be some skepticism. That Canadian shield is pretty powerful in Canadian agriculture and in politics, of course, as well.
Sangeeta, I'm curious, again, you were the BC desk in your time in government. Kind of how do you see that East versus West dynamic playing out in politics today, and what does that mean for kind of life after the election and decisions that are going to be made in government?
I mean, it definitely does exist. There are differences across the country, and those need to be recognized. And it's important to have people at the table from the various different regions of the country so that they can bring that perspective to Ottawa and ensure that those voices are heard. So whether that's through the staffers or through ministers, through industry associations that get engaged, government does need to consider voices from across the country when they are making decisions.
And go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean, as a Western Canadian, I'm not going to speak for all farmers, but I would say that I've often found, as I'm sure anyone on the line has, that when you go visit Atlantic Canada, there's a lot more in common, I think, those Westerners have with Atlantic Canadians than they have difference. So I think the answer to that is yes. It depends on what they're there to talk about and the policies that are going to be reflected, right? Like it's a matter of, do I see my priorities reflected in the priorities of this individual? And I think that Minister Blois does have some standing, I would say, and through his years of work on the Agriculture Committee, and has been able to hit the ground running in the very short runway that he did have in terms of getting first connection and contact with stakeholders. We'll have to see, and we'll see who wins and what kind of mandate they're given for that. But I don't think that the region so much matters as long as they're speaking the same language in terms of reflecting the proper priorities.
And again, I think it's worth kind of acknowledging that change that was alluded to earlier around how kind of things have seemingly flipped. The kind of the liberal environment commitment in the platform today is more money for the Agriculture Clean Technology Program, which I think is very different than the kind of the type of ag environment commitments that we saw in past Liberal platforms, and I think speaks to some of those differences. I kind of want to maybe wrap up around kind of a discussion on trade, because it has, as has been acknowledged several times, trade has come up regularly throughout the election debate. That is kind of often the venue into agriculture. We've got kind of two sets of questions. One is around supply management, and the question is supply management explained enough to the population? I think my recollection is that it is the only ag issue that came up in the leaders' debate. There was quite a lengthy discussion on it in the French leaders' debate, where they talked about the importance of supply management. I've wondered, though, if often that's kind of the easy go-to thing for leaders to talk about in an election campaign, because it's easy to say, I support supply management, without having to really understand the nuances of what that means or where that goes, or kind of other wonky type election promises. Kelvin, do you want to kind of give your thoughts around where supply management fits in the ag policy political debate and discussion, and kind of what we should read into how well people understand it or not, and what it means in the broader context?
Well, I'll start with a disclaimer. You mentioned before that I spend time in a chicken barn here. So yes, I have some ties to a supply managed sector in terms of poultry and the chicken industry here in Canada. And so I do think that it is often used as a crutch by our federal politicians. We're sticking up for farmers is what they say, when they really mean supply management. And I think that is often unintentionally offensive to the rest of Canadian agriculture that is not part of supply management. And the current government has certainly used that type of messaging fairly often, and that hasn't helped in terms of building relationships with trade-dependent, export-dependent sectors. And so it is always at the forefront, and I expect it will continue to be at the forefront. We talk about how Canada-U.S. relations in the future of that trade deal, whatever it looks like, affects our exports, but it also will affect, or potentially could affect, our supply managed sectors. And so I think it is important, and it's an important part of this discussion. But yeah, it often gets more, I think, more public attention from politicians than maybe what it should. And I also agree with the premise of the question, though, that it probably isn't as well understood as what it could be either, and hasn't been explained not only to Canadians but to the politicians that are talking about it as well as it could be.
So Jeff, we'll get in on this one.
Yeah, I think just quickly, I think back to Kelvin's point about wanting, specific answers in debates and questions. This is an issue where all major political parties seem to have alignment in terms of their staunch support or defense of the system. But there's some very real questions that are going to be coming on this one, specific to our friends south of the border there, who, it doesn't matter Republican, Democrat, anytime you go down there, are aware of this system and raise it as something they see as very unfair. And so a question that may be put to a leader is, well, you say it's off the table, or you say you protect the system, but we have a trading partner who's going to demand some concessions. And I wouldn't say ask for concessions, I would say demand concessions, if we've seen kind of their tone and approach. And what are you going to do when all the chips are down on the table? Will we walk away from free trade with the world's largest economy for the protection of 10,000 dairy producers, kind of for those rough numbers, or what will you do? And I think that's the hard part about governing. I can understand why no party is rushing to the mic to answer that one yet, but I do think that we're going to see, whether it's over the next few months, year or 2 years, this issue bubble up in a big way, and whoever is in government is going to have some tough decisions to make, and then some tough decisions to communicate on, both to Canadians who are on either side of the argument.
And it's worth noting that question was put to the ag critics during the ag leaders debate, and I think the main candidates all did a good job of skating around any specific positions around what decision they would actually make on this. Kelvin?
Among the things that were not mentioned in the Conservative platform as well this week was the term supply management.
But again, I wouldn't read too much into that, because agriculture was largely not mentioned in the platform either. So I wouldn't worry too much if you're a dairy farmer. Maybe kind of segue to kind of the last set of questions around kind of what comes next and afterwards. And Jeff, if I could just get you to go first. We got a specific question around kind of what advice would you give the government on dealing with China, the market access, those relationships. This is part of kind of your day job, things that you guys are working on at Pulse Canada. But maybe take a step back from specifically China retaliatory tariffs and how that plays out, and what are you looking for the next government to do, or kind of what's your expectations for what they'll do broadly on ag and trade and kind of where we go on that.
It's interesting. Trade has come up a lot in the last, 6 months, we'll say. And people are really rallying behind the fact it's a good thing and we need more of it. And that's obviously right up our alley, specific to the pulse sector that exports 85% of what we grow. Advice would be Canada needs friends. We need friends in the world right now, reliable partners with whom we can trade. And I wouldn't shy away from looking at any market at this point right now. But bilateral, strong relationships, I think, are what's going to be needed for Canada to not only diversify in terms of exports and reliance on one or two markets, but also to take advantage of the opportunity that's out there. We have great products and we have a great reputation. We've got a lot of things internally that we can do to help better facilitate trade, but we need markets for them to go to. And so it would be get to the table, get Canada's name out there. We've had perhaps 10 years of frostier relationships with some key trading partners that I know our sector and others rely on. And regardless of who forms government, I think getting a new face out there, getting ministers in market, having a Canada's open for business kind of approach is something that we're going to be looking for.
Great. And so, Jeff, my last question was going to be, what's one thing you'd like to see the government do? Is that your answer? That kind of focus on trade?
Get out there and fly the flag because we need friends.
Great. Thank you. Sangeeta, over to you. What's one thing you'd like to see the next government do early in its mandate?
I agree with Jeff. Trade diversification needs to be a top priority, especially just given what's happening in the world right now. And that would be one of the best ways that I think that the government can serve all farmers across the country. And the file I typically will focus on is on digitization of the agriculture sector. And judging from the polls, it sounds like the Liberals are headed towards forming government. They had quite a few items in their platform on supporting AI and supporting digitization. And I would like to see the agriculture sector be central to those discussions, because the impact that both technology and AI can have on production in the country is significant. And it's an industry that should absolutely be included in those discussions and be central to those discussions. And that'll be just that much more we can trade with the rest of the world.
And Sangeeta, it is worth going back to the mandate letter discussion. There was a time when the Liberal mandate letter to the agriculture minister did not mention trade, but I do expect that will be quite a focus of the mandate letter for the next agriculture minister, regardless of what party it is.
And hopefully we get to see it.
Yeah. Well, again, I think there's a big debate around the value of public mandate letters. And again, I was in government at the time they were private, and I think that they're more value and not having them be communication exercises. But that's maybe a debate for a future time. Kelvin, what's one thing you'd like to see the government do after the election?
I think whoever forms government, we've seen a major switch over the last couple of years, especially on the conservative side of things, and in terms of liberal policy over the last couple of months since Mark Carney took the reins. Not so much change in terms of the cabinet ministers behind him so far, but there's been a big shift to focusing on economic growth, on trade, export opportunities, diversifying exports, and back at home on productivity and boosting productivity. And I'd like to see follow through on that, whoever forms government after this election. In agriculture, productivity is something that we've maybe gotten away from in terms of government spending, whether it's research, whether it's the language used talking about environmental outcomes. I think there's a good story to tell there about productivity, and government has a role in, there's a public good for Canadian agriculture, for farmers, and for all Canadians in investing in boosting our productivity at home here too. So I'd like to see, I guess, in general, follow through on some of the big discussion commitments that have been made here during the election campaign.
And so the election is on Monday. Jeff had to leave, but so he's going to miss this question. We'll go around and ask for some predictions from our panelists. Kelvin, what's your prediction for the outcome on Monday?
Did Jeff just run away?
I guess he didn't want to have to go on the record of answering this question. So it's up to the three of us. Kelvin?
It's tough to figure out which polls or which pollster to put the most weight in, but it's sure looking like a Liberal government after the election based on the polls and even the seat projections. There's hardly any scenarios. And I think from the Conservatives' perspective, best case scenario might be a Liberal minority with the Bloc holding the power in terms of reaching majority in the House of Commons. But yeah, looking like a Liberal win probably on Monday.
Sangeeta, thoughts?
Again, based on polls, it looks like it'll be a Liberal win on the 28th. But I'm from BC, and in 2013, during the provincial election, there were reports about how Adrian Dix could kick a dog and he would win the election with the BC NDP. And yet Christy Clark just blew it away and shocked everybody. So we'll have to wait and see end of day on the 28th to see what Canadians decide.
Right, and so maybe I'm the one that seems like it's going to be the safe, kind of predictable outcome of a Liberal majority government. Actually, my thing would be is I'm maybe going to be surprised at the number of rural seats, especially in Eastern Canada, the Liberal Party might win, and that's certainly something that I'm going to be watching for to see if in Quebec, in particular, those vote splits means that we have a larger Liberal rural caucus than what we've had in the past. So I'd like to thank Jeff and Kelvin and Sangeeta for joining us today. We have another webinar coming up next week, April 30th at 11 a.m. as looking at certification in regenerative agriculture. Please register for that. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists for taking part. Have a great day.